Dan and Joyce Ahrens didn't fully grasp the significance of their experience until the early 1990s. Back in the fall of 1976, while in West Plains, Missouri, they unwittingly became part of an alien abduction incident. Little did they know, this incident would set off a chain of events that would not only impact them, but also leave a lasting mark on their children, both at that moment and for years to come. The encounters that unfolded would go down in history as some of the most intense cases of recurring alien abductions ever documented. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. As we delve into this case, we'll see just how deeply they affected this family, particularly Dan and Joyce's two children. Their story serves as a startling reminder of the unsettling and life-altering nature of encounters with apparent alien abductions. While some skeptics may raise doubts about the authenticity of the family's experiences, a closer examination of the details reveals a truly compelling case. The accounts provided by the Ahrens family appear credible and align closely with numerous other reports of alien abductions from across the globe and throughout history. One evening in the fall of 1976, Dan and Joyce Ahrens had just tucked in their children, 3-year-old Daniel and 1-year-old Heather, and they were getting ready to settle into bed themselves when a strange red light flooded their bedroom with an eerie glow. At first, they thought it might just be a fire outside, and so Dan hurried to go and alert Joyce. However, despite his efforts when he opened his mouth to shout for his wife, no sound came out. He found himself unable to utter a single word, as if his voice had vanished. It was at that moment that they both realised something chilling. They couldn't move. They were completely paralysed, unable to even utter a single sound. Needless to say, they were both completely terrified by what was going on. They knew fine well that they were both awake just seconds before this strange light appeared. They knew there was no chance that they were dreaming, and they knew that whatever was happening to them was very real. Years later, Joyce vividly recalled the sensation of feeling strangely disconnected from her body. She explained that the only part of her that she could move were her eyes. Inside her mind, she was screaming as loudly as she possibly could, trapped in a state of utter helplessness.
I was laying on my right side and I felt different. I couldn't feel my body. I was like paralyzed. The only thing that I could move was my eyes. I couldn't speak. I was in my head was screaming for Dan to help me because I thought something was really wrong with me. I was just paralyzed.
Though the episode lasted only a few seconds, it seemed to stretch on for an eternity for the couple. Then, as abruptly as it began, this mysterious red light vanished, plunging the room back into darkness. Instantly, both Dan and Joyce regained control of their bodies and the ability to speak. With the ability to move being restored, Dan leaned over to the bedroom window and drew back the curtain, voicing his fear aloud. What the hell was that? Joyce, still feeling the lingering confusion, admitted she didn't have a clue. Their attention then shifted to Heather's crib, where she had been peacefully asleep just moments before. Now she was standing up, her eyes wide and seemingly larger than usual. Both Dan and Joyce were completely baffled by what they had just experienced. In a rather odd turn of events, instead of discussing their unsettling occurrence that night, they simply settled their daughter back into her crib and then returned to bed. Strangely enough, they wouldn't speak of this incident for years to come. When Dan and Joyce finally decided to delve into the bizarre events of that autumn evening back in 1976, prompted by reaching out to a researcher who specialised in such phenomena, they uncovered a startling revelation. They weren't the only ones in the family who had experienced something strange that night, and in the nights that followed. Heather, for instance, recounted 20 years later that she had been haunted by a recurring nightmare for as long as she could remember. She described it as involving a gigantic monster, though she struggled to articulate this fully, explaining that the dream had a dark and unsettling quality. However, she distinctly remembered encountering a strange eye within the dream, in which she could see her own reflection staring back at her. When she was around 11 years old, Heather took a significant step in confronting her experiences by drawing a picture of this monster from her recurring nightmares. Remarkably, the illustration bore a striking resemblance to what we now commonly recognise as a typical grey alien. What makes this revelation even more compelling is that neither Heather nor the rest of the Ahrens family had any prior knowledge of alien abductions at the time. Furthermore, Heather created this drawing before the release of Whitley Strieber's book detailing his own alien abduction, Communion, which famously featured an almost identical depiction on its cover. Reflecting on this moment about a decade later, Joyce admitted that she and her husband, they didn't quite grasp the significance of Heather's drawing back then. She recalled feeling unsure about what Heather was trying to convey, and, as a result, dismissed it as merely a product of her vivid imagination, possibly influenced by her intense recurring nightmares. However, Heather wasn't the only one showing signs of having experienced something out of the ordinary. In hindsight, the Ahrens came to realise that their son Daniel also seemed to have undergone an extraordinary experience. 2 decades later, he admitted that he strongly believed something significant had occurred back in 1976. Dan Sr. recounted instances where they would wake up in the morning only to find Daniel missing from his bedroom, prompting them to go and search the house. They would often discover him in various unexpected locations, such as in a closet, or under a chair, or beneath a table. Dan described these occurrences as very strange, suggesting that it seemed as though Daniel was hiding from something, although neither he nor his father could pinpoint exactly what that was. It wasn't until a decade and a half later that Dan Sr. experienced another bizarre incident. Joyce remembered receiving a distressing phone call from her husband while he was at work. He urgently requested her to come and pick him up and drive him straight to the hospital. During the car ride to the hospital, Dan recounted feeling his heart racing and struggling to catch his breath. The sensation was so intense that he feared that he might be having a heart attack. After being admitted to the hospital, doctors swiftly determined that Dan thankfully wasn't experiencing a heart attack. However, they were puzzled by his symptoms and couldn't pinpoint the exact cause of his distress. Multiple doctors examined Dan and his symptoms, but their conclusions varied. One doctor speculated that Dan might be suffering from a series of panic attacks, possibly triggered by some severe stress, although the reasons behind this remained unclear. Another doctor suggested the possibility of an inner ear infection. Despite both these hypotheses, Dan's condition remained undiagnosed. Following that wee health scare, Dan withdrew from his usual activities, effectively becoming a recluse. Joyce remembered how he seemed incapable of doing anything. He couldn't work, and he couldn't even bring himself to leave the house. As time passed, Joyce couldn't shake the feeling that there was nothing physically amiss with her husband. Instead, it seemed that something had been troubling him mentally. Dan himself began to suspect that there might be something lurking in the depths of his mind, just waiting to come out. Eventually, that latent something did indeed make its presence known, breaking through to the forefront of Dan's conscious mind. One night, while watching the movie Communion at home, Dan experienced a profound revelation. There was this specific scene in that movie that struck a chord with him, a moment where a little alien peeked out from behind a doorway. As soon as that scene unfolded, Dan was overcome with emotion. He described how tears welled up in his eyes, recalling how the sight of those piercing eyes staring out from behind that door triggered a sudden flashback to the events of 1976. In that fleeting moment, Dan felt transported back to that fateful night, experiencing a vivid recollection of what actually transpired. Joyce observed Dan's intense reaction firsthand, noting that he was absolutely hysterical and overcome with tears. At the time, she was baffled by his emotional response and couldn't comprehend the reason behind it. However, this pivotal moment prompted Dan and Joyce to start thinking about whether there might actually be a connection between what Dan had witnessed in the movie Communion and the strange events of that night back in 1976. They also began to entertain the possibility that Dan's debilitating panic attacks, which rendered him housebound, might somehow all be linked to these experiences. So, about a week later, while watching television again, Dan stumbled upon a programme featuring a psychiatric therapist called John Carpenter. Carpenter had garnered attention for his extensive work with individuals who firmly believed that they had been victims of alien abduction. Referrals poured in from other therapists, including the renowned Bud Hopkins, and Carpenter had already delved into over 100 cases. Intrigued by Carpenter's expertise, Dan reached out to him. With Carpenter's guidance, Dan started piecing together the events of that fateful night back in '76, slowly unravelling the mystery that had haunted him for years. As soon as Dan started recounting the peculiar events of that mid-1970s evening to Bud Hopkins, including the strange panic attacks and his overwhelming reaction to the movie Communion, Hopkins cautioned that they should remain open to other explanations besides going straight for alien abduction. However, as the conversation unfolded and Dan delved deeper into his memories, it became increasingly apparent that alternative explanations were unlikely. Dan underwent hypnotic regression therapy to further explore his experiences, leading to revelations that reinforced the likelihood of alien involvement.
He suffered from a panic disorder at that point in time, and he had flashbacks and nightmarish images of these beings, but didn't understand what was going on and needed some relief.
During the hypnotic regression session, as Dan was transported back to that fateful night in '76, he described encountering a strange figure that seemed to be showing him something. When Carpenter encouraged him to take a closer look at this object, Dan hesitated before describing the object as being metallic, resembling a small spade, and expressing a sense of impending pain associated with it. Initially, Dan kept the details of this session to himself. However, shortly after beginning these sessions, Joyce also began to experience her own flashback recollections. But for Joyce, it wasn't just brief flashbacks. She described a flood of conscious memories rushing back at her. Following these sudden recollections, Joyce also visited Carpenter to undergo hypnotic regression. And it wasn't long after that that Carpenter realised that not only had both the Ahrens likely been abducted, but they had likely been abducted together at the same time. It became apparent through these sessions that the strange evening marked the couple's first shared abduction experience. As they delved deeper into their memories under hypnosis, the Ahrens began to reconstruct the events of that fateful night. Dan vividly recalled feeling paralysed with fear, cowering in the corner of the bed. He described a chilling sight, a small being standing at the foot of the bed, an eerie presence that sent shivers down his spine. Meanwhile, Joyce had her own encounter with another being, and a third entity was present at the crib where baby Heather had been sleeping that night. Joyce also recollected encountering 3 of the unsettling entities, vividly remembering the sensation of one of them touching her arm, which jolted her upright in bed. She watched in sheer horror as they lifted Heather out of the crib and started to carry her away. Reflecting on this experience years later, Joyce expressed the profound sense of helplessness that she felt, emphasising how the aliens seemed to exert complete control over this situation. She said it was like watching a kidnapper snatch your child away while being utterly powerless to intervene. Dan also remembered witnessing the distressing scene unfold, describing overwhelming feelings of helplessness as he watched these events unfold before him. Under regression, he recounted how one of the beings approached the crib, leaving him absolutely paralysed and powerless to do anything. Joyce then added that both she and Dan were escorted outside by these mysterious beings before the entire family was seemingly levitated up into a craft. Reflecting on this experience, she expressed regret and sorrow, stating that she never wanted her children to endure such a terrifying ordeal. It was only later that she realised the extent to which they had been affected by these events. While it was now abundantly clear that the entire Ahrens family had seemingly been subject to a harrowing alien abduction ordeal, it would be a further 5 years before Heather, at this point in her early 20s, agreed to also undergo hypnosis. And these revelations would be startling. Carpenter advised Dan and Joyce to be really cautious about discussing the details that they uncovered during their hypnotic sessions in front of their children. They both suspected that their children might also have been abducted by these same creatures, and they didn't want to inadvertently influence any suppressed memories that their children might have during these events. Initially, Heather was highly sceptical about the entire idea of hypnotic regression, and whether it would reveal anything significant. However, once the session began, memories and flashes flooded her mind almost instantly. She remembered being taken out of her room by one of the beings and brought on board some sort of vessel. She would remember that the strange creature repeatedly asked her if she wanted to play, specifically suggesting telepathic games. Heather always responded that she didn't want to play and just simply wanted to go home. Despite repeatedly being found asleep in different rooms in the house, young Daniel maintained that he hadn't been involved in any of these strange events. However, 2 decades after the incident in 1976, he acknowledged that something had obviously happened to his parents and sister. Yet he admitted feeling too scared to delve into what memories he might hold. Even when his parents discussed the encounter, Daniel found it far too emotional to listen to any of the details. Eventually though, he also agreed to undergo hypnotic regression. Carpenter pointed to Daniel's recurring dreams, which had haunted him since childhood, as a potential exploration point. He suggested that this dream likely stemmed from suppressed memories of a very real event and could provide valuable insights. After ensuring Daniel understood the fundamentals of this hypnotic regression, including reassuring him that his family's recollection of these bizarre events didn't necessarily mean that he had experienced them, Carpenter guided him back to his childhood, when he was around 5 years old. Eventually, Carpenter prompted Daniel to recall the recurring dreams, asking him where he was when the dream begins. Daniel responded that he was in bed and that he could hear a noise that sounded like a tin can dropping. When asked where the sound was coming from, Daniel said that it was coming from the garage. At this point, he could recall feeling so scared that he didn't want to even go and look. Daniel suddenly found himself no longer in his familiar room, but in an entirely unfamiliar location. One that he described as unlike anything he had ever seen before. He vividly remembered the surroundings as stony, which is a curious and intriguing detail. It's noteworthy that many other individuals who claim to have been abducted also recall their surroundings as having a stone-like appearance. Some even liken them to biblical settings, while others report seeing furniture and tables made of a stone-like material. This does raise intriguing questions about the nature of these encounters. Are these crafts, at least internally, constructed from a material similar to stone? Or could it simply be that abductees are not taken aboard a futuristic spacecraft, but rather maybe to an underground cave-like location? As young Daniel delved deeper into his memories under hypnosis, he remembered encountering 2 peculiar beings standing before him. He described them as tall, with elongated fingers, large heads, and dark, piercing eyes. As the session progressed, it became apparent that Daniel was recalling the entities approaching him. Despite the evident fear that he felt, Daniel provided further details about these strange beings. He noted that they lacked any hair or visible ears and had mouths that resembled coin slots. Adding to this unsettling encounter, Daniel recalled that one of the figures held something in his hand, resembling a shiny stick. He described it as wand-like and noted how the figure made it move in front of him. Then, in a disturbing turn of events, it seemed that the figure placed the stick either on or even into the back of Daniel's head, a detail that echoes numerous other abduction accounts. Many abduction narratives feature descriptions of a stick-like device being touched to the skin, often causing paralysis, or placed against the head, sometimes resulting in visions or the transfer of information. Daniel further mentioned that when this stick-like object was placed against his head, it caused him intense pain. When Daniel was eventually brought out of this hypnosis session, which lasted more than 2 hours, Carpenter would ask him one simple question. "That wasn't a dream, was it, Dan?" To which Daniel replied, as if he had always known the truth, "No, it wasn't." Before the hypnosis session, Carpenter inquired about any unusual marks, bruises, or cuts that Daniel might have noticed on his body. Daniel did remember one specific instance when he had indeed discovered something strange. He had said that waking up one morning, and, as was his routine, he headed off to the bathroom. However, on this particular morning he noticed a spoon-shaped mark on his left inner thigh. Perplexed, he immediately informed his father about this strange mark. expressing confusion about its origin. To his astonishment, his father revealed that he too had discovered the exact same mark in the exact same spot on his own body. After the session, Daniel was left in an extremely emotional state, deeply affected by the memories and revelations that had surfaced. He expressed his sentiments to the Sightings television show, emphasising that if one had never experienced alien abduction, they should consider themselves fortunate. He adamantly stated that he wouldn't wish such an experience on anyone.
If it's never happened to you, feel fortunate. I don't wish it upon anybody. I don't think anybody should.
Carpenter was also interviewed for the same TV show, and he just echoed Daniel's sentiments, highlighting the misconception that alien abduction experiences are mere entertainment or fabricated stories. He suggested that those who hold such beliefs might reconsider if they had the opportunity to witness the profound confusion, trauma and panic experienced by individuals during the regression sessions. The Ahrens family not only believed that they, including Dan, Joyce and their 2 children, had been subject to repeated alien abductions, but they also suspected that at least one of their grandchildren had encountered these potentially ominous beings. This grandchild referred to them as his little buddies, who visited his room to play. On one occasion, after what could have been another encounter, he even expressed to his grandmother Joyce that he wanted to watch the ship leave. These unsettling encounters only added to the family's conviction that they had been targeted by these mysterious entities. The phenomenon of repeat abduction encounters spanning multiple generations within the same family, it's not uncommon in UFO and alien circles. Many researchers and enthusiasts attribute this to various factors, including the possibility of genetic predispositions within the family and their suitability for whatever agenda lies behind these encounters. One recurring detail in these abduction experiences is the presence of strange implants, a phenomenon Joyce also recalled. During one of her abduction encounters, she remembered a being using a very long needle pressed against her right temple. Joyce vividly recalled hearing a crunching sound as she suspected a tiny alien device was inserted into her head. Some skeptics, particularly those who doubt the existence of UFOs at all, were suspicious that the Ahrens family might have just fabricated the entire affair before the hypnotic regression sessions even took place. However, as Carpenter points out, this suggestion, while not entirely implausible, hinges on the assumption that the family members were all aware of the trick questions and leading suggestions and knew exactly how to navigate through them successfully. These techniques are often unique to the individual conducting the session, in this instance Carpenter himself. This casts doubt on the notion that the family could have orchestrated these experiences to align with the hypnotic regression sessions. Carpenter also underscores that there are numerous details that the family wouldn't have been privy to, details that regression therapists like himself would be specifically looking for as markers of truthfulness or reliability, especially in comparison with other abduction data. In essence, while not entirely impossible, orchestrating such a hoax would be highly improbable. He suggests that the family is likely to be credible individuals whose accounts should be treated with the seriousness they deserve, rather than being dismissed outright, as be the case with some. Whether the Ahrens family continues to experience these strange encounters to this day, that remains unknown. It seems they have no desire to seek widespread publicity and prefer, as much as possible, to lead what most would consider a normal life. It's also worth noting at this point an article posted on an internet forum back in 2002, authored by Dan Ahrens himself. In this article, it was suggested that both of the Ahrens children had experienced significant and long-lasting mental effects from these encounters. Dan acknowledged that speaking publicly about these encounters posed a huge risk, with potentially more to lose than gain, a concern shared by many other abductees. These are compelling reasons to consider the credibility of the Ahrens family and to accept that they may indeed have been victims of some sort of alien abduction, as commonly understood. However, it's worth considering the possibility that while the Ahrens family is undoubtedly sincere in their accounts, the experiences they describe as alien abduction may not necessarily involve extraterrestrial beings. Instead, They could represent some form of manifestation of the collective human psyche. While we won't delve deeply into this theory here, it's a possibility that must be acknowledged, especially given the undeniable strangeness of this experience.
Mental thing that's happening to people, then why aren't the scientists or the doctors or whatever trying to find a cure?
That's it for this video, folks. Thanks ever so much for taking the time to check it out. Stay safe out there, tell someone that you love them, and above all else, remember, keep smiling.